Hello, everyone, and welcome back to JoJo's Book Club. Today's story is called The Power of Her Pen, the story of groundbreaking journalist Ethel L. Payne. This story was written by Lisa Klein Ransom and it's illustrated by John Para. This book is published by Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers. Like you. The Power of Her Pen. Ethel Lois Payne has always had an ear for stories. Her grandparents' front porch stories of Kentucky cotton fields and Tennessee auction blocks. Her parents' kitchen table stories of northbound trains from sharecroppers' plots. Long past her bedtime, Ethel collected the stories of people who followed a path paved with dreams. In 1911, the year Ethel was born, her father William worked as a Pullman porter on railroad trains, helping passengers with their luggage and serving them in dining cars on trains that crisscrossed the country. He tossed bundles of a newspaper called the Chicago Defender onto train platforms, spreading news of jobs and hope for blacks in the segregated South. Ethel didn't see her daddy much, but his firm hand ruled from a distance. He and her mama, Bessie, a Latin teacher, filled their home with an equal measure of discipline and love. On Saturdays, once the house was spotless, Bessie took Ethel and her 5 siblings to the white side of town, where there were libraries with shelves stacked tall with books. There, Ethel flipped through pages and memorized passages to recite to anyone who would listen. I miss going to the library. Are you still going to the library? We can pick up library books by ordering them online, and then we go to a special room and pick them up. But I do miss going inside. However, 1 month after Ethel started high school, her father came home after a long run on the railroads and took to bed, sick with a headache. The house was hushed, the doctor was called, but nothing could be done. After William passed, Bessie worked hard to make ends meet. Ethel walked a mile to school each day. The neighborhood residents screamed and yelled and threw rocks at a black girl who dared to go to school with whites. Sometimes I stood my ground. Sometimes I got a bloody nose from fighting. But that's just the way it was, Ethel later recalled. Ethel spent her school days daydreaming of life far beyond her neighborhood, except when she was in English class. There, her teacher, Miss Dixon, encouraged her writing. Her mother encouraged her at home. Ethel wrote during the day, and she read her stories aloud to her family at night. The school wouldn't let a black student work on the school newspaper, but after reading Ethel's writing, it did publish her very first story. During the Great Depression, with money even tighter than before, Ethel attended a local college with free tuition and took writing classes. When World War II began, the United States fought overseas while Ethel fought against racism and injustice in her own backyard. She started by organizing a women's social group at her church to make improvements in her community. Then she started a story hour for children. Next, she started a scholarship fund. After battling long and hard in Chicago, Ethel set her sights on politics in Washington, D.C., and began writing letters to newspapers commenting on unjust laws and discrimination against blacks. I was beginning to have the seeds of rebellion churning up in me, Ethel later said. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Ethel was aching to see a world far beyond the south side of Chicago. She got the chance when she answered a newspaper ad for a job overseas. With her mother's blessing, she was on her way to Tokyo, Japan. What an exciting story. I wonder what she will discover when she goes to Japan and how that will affect her stories. Let's find out. Ethel set off to explore, filling page after diary page with her observations and her experiences. Some pages she devoted to the stories of Black soldiers. Life as a club social director on a U.S. military base kept her busy organizing activities for these soldiers. But she noticed that even in Japan, Black soldiers who had fought alongside white American soldiers had separate housing, the hardest jobs on the base, and almost no chance to get promoted. Ethel never imagined her voice would soon be heard in the United States, all the way from Japan. Ethel showed her diary entries to a friend, a reporter who was on assignment in Japan. With Ethel's permission, he shared her writing with his editor back in Chicago. Her sister was the first to call with the news. One of Ethel's articles about Black soldiers stationed in Japan had made its way across the seas and into newspaper headlines, which were now in the hands of thousands. I wonder how that must have felt to have thousands of people reading things that you write. Would you feel nervous? Would you feel proud? Maybe both? When her job in Japan ended in 1951, Ethel returned to her home, her family, and a job offer from the Chicago Defender, one of the only two daily Black newspapers in the country and the main source of news in the Black community. It celebrated the births, graduations, marriages, and retirement news of Black citizens. Ethel once joked, "You don't grow up in Chicago and be Black if you don't know the Chicago Defender." So that must be a very important newspaper. As the features reporter, Ethel wrote about housing, jobs, healthcare, and community events. After 1 year, Ethel and her notebook headed to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where politicians debated civil rights. As more and more readers opened their newspapers to read the articles written by Ethel L. Payne, the Defender's circulation grew. After 3 years, her editor said, "Why don't you go down to Washington?" How amazing that her writing is taking her all over the place. Of the 204 reporters, Ethel was one of only 3 Black journalists issued a White House press pass. It allowed her to sit in the treaty room of the White House where the president met with journalists. Only when the president nodded could a reporter ask a question. These experienced reporters knew how to jump to their feet, hoping that their voices would be the ones to reach the president's ears. Joe Biden is currently our president. I wonder if you had a chance to ask the president anything, what would you ask? You should write your question down and maybe try to mail it if you can't ask directly. At first, Ethel sat waiting. Then she stood. Then she waited some more. Finally, President Dwight D. Eisenhower turned to Ethel and he nodded. "Mr. President," Ethel began shakily. "Mr. President." She looked down at her carefully written question and she asked the president about his views on a racial incident that had occurred at the White House. Notice how everyone around her, what do you notice about all of these reporters? How is she the same as them? And how is she different? I wonder what the response to her question was. "U.S. Negro reporter draws Ike's wrath," a headline screamed, meaning that they thought she was causing quite a ruckus. But Ethel kept asking questions. The white press was so busy asking questions on other issues that Blacks and their problems were completely ignored, she later recalled. She asked how the president planned to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling in the Brown versus the Board of Education case, which outlawed segregation. "I wish that all people could understand that we want for our children the same rights as any other human being," she later explained. That's an important question to ask. When Eisenhower left office in 1961, Ethel asked the young president, John F. Kennedy, about his civil voting rights record. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, she asked Lyndon B. Johnson about the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Act. Then she asked Mr. Richard Nixon questions about the lack of Blacks in his administration. And Jimmy Carter, she asked questions on education. Ethel spent so much time in the White House, she earned the title First Lady of the Black Press. That's pretty cool. She got to meet and talk to a lot of presidents. Outside the White House, Ethel interviewed protesters in Montgomery, Alabama, and Little Rock, Arkansas, and she marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Somebody had to do the fighting. Somebody had to speak up, Ethel later declared. Writing stories of the protesters' struggles was her way of doing just that. And if you have seen any protests recently, you'll also notice that there's always reporters there telling their stories. It's an important job to do. For nearly 5 decades, Ethel fought long and hard to bring attention to the issues that mattered most to her community and become the voice of those who had none. Ethel wrote the stories that the mainstream media refused to. It was her questions to presidents that finally made readers of all races pay attention to the plight of African Americans. Her reporting highlighted their struggle for justice, equal pay, housing, and education. And in her role of informing her readers, Ethel created awareness and activism in the fight for civil rights for people across the globe. Always with an ear for stories, Ethel asked the questions and demanded the answers for people whose paths were paved with dreams. "I've had a box seat on history," Ethel once said, "and that's a rare thing." And that, my friends, is the end. I encourage you to get this book at home and to read through the author's note. But before we go, I want to show you a real picture of Ethel L. Payne. That's what she really looked like. I hope you enjoyed today's story, and I can't wait to read to you again next time. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.